You've tuned into Radio Northern Beaches. We live stream on rnb.org.au across the northern beaches of New South Wales, Australia and all over the world. You can also catch us local on 88.7 and 90.3 FM. Our podcasts are available at your convenience at rnb.org.au or rnbpodcast.com.au. Don't forget to check out our social media, Facebook and Instagram, which you can access from our website rnb.org.au. So you and your friends don't miss any episodes. Don't forget to follow and share. Now here's our latest podcast.
Welcome again, listeners, to Community Radio Northern Beaches 88.7 and 90.3 FM, streaming live on our website www.rnb.org.au, Radio Northern Beaches podcasts.com.au, but we're on all the podcast platforms. I'm Michael Lester, and our program's Innovation Talk. Photography and the technology of photography was first developed in Paris by Monsieur Daguerre and his daguerreotypes. This was around 1839, 1840, and it was not long thereafter that the technology of photography made its way across into Australia, where it was taken up and adapted and shaping, in a sense, our own sense of cultural identity and awareness in particularly the colonial era. I'm delighted to be welcoming our guest, Dr. Eliza DeCourcy, who's written a book published by Maigana Press under the Melbourne University Publishing an imprint. It's called Early Photography in Colonial Australia. Eliza is a writer and curator of photography, and in particular, she's based at the ANU under an Australian Research Council fellowship, under which she wrote this book in the art history area. Her book focuses on the colonial history of photography in Australia, particularly the period between 1840 and 1860. So thanks very much for joining us on Radio Northern Beaches, Eliza.
Thanks very much, Michael. It's nice to be here.
The whole concept of this book is absolutely intriguing, and I understand that it's probably a first, certainly such a detailed look at this particularly early foundational formative period of photography in Australia, as I say, the early colonial 1840 to 1860. What motivated you to try to, as I think in your language, resituate the oldest photographs in Australia's collections as historically consequential objects? There have been many books written about Australian photography and the history of Australian photography. Why was this a gap?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I guess the history of any technology like photography is always a history that is predicated on moments of rupture and change. And I think the existing narrative before I took on this project was there was a feeble start for photography, not only in Europe as the first technologies emerged, but also when those technologies were exported to the Australian colonies. And for a number of reasons, not only because those first technologies, you mentioned the daguerreotype, but there's also a number of paper-based processes that I look at in the book, didn't have the same analog formula that we know to be true of later photographic processes, where one negative can be used to reprint lots of different positives of the same image. So the daguerreotype, for example, the plate that you put in the camera is both the negative and the positive, and only one photograph extant image is yielded. And I think because of that, there is this overarching narrative that's not geographically specific, that there is this slow start to a culture of photography, which in our world today is so evasive and inescapable. And I guess the title of the book, Early Photography in Colonial Australia, is a very succinct kind of title, but it's also a bit of a misnomer, because what I wanted to do in this book is resituate those early photographs, not as kind of rare examples of the early expression of photographic culture, but more as images within a broader system of image making, thinking about them in relation to a culture of print that for many centuries had tried to achieve a level of indexicality, a level of true to life representation that photographs achieved, trying to think of them in relation to, cultures of painting, cultures of press reporting, cultures of image and information dissemination. So rather than this narrative that kind of exists in archives, that is that there are these rare few images from this early period of practice, I want to think about them more as kind of examples of a rupture of visual culture that achieved something that was really consequential in the first decades of photographic practice, rather than being rare and volatile and vulnerable as they are now, because they are examples of the oldest photographs that we have. So they're, from a conservation point of view, very fragile. I wanted to reposition them as kind of consequential, as in part of the history that they are kind of, they're active in shaping.
Yes, well, Lisa, I think that's right. We're all used to in visiting museums and galleries and all the rest, and even reading books of history and seeing the photos, which are very much treated, as you say, as objects, as artifacts in themselves, out of any particular context, and treated as delicate objects rather than a part of an evolving history. But as you say, the fact of the matter was that this technology came to Australia and was developed synchronously with colonization. I think there's a phrase somewhere in a quote, Colonial Australia grew up with photography, and as a result, we've been rethinking and reshaping our view of colonization through that. But I'm wondering, how did you go about, in terms of your research method, in trying to develop this richer, fuller picture of the interaction between the technology and the society in those early years? Must have involved a lot of archival research and digging around, and perhaps in ways that previous researchers hadn't done?
I guess, yes. The book is based on investigations in 72 collections in Australia and overseas, which is the real privilege of having a research funded position, because you can go back and look at archival material that maybe isn't digitized or accessible from your computer at home. I think one really important thing to say is that because photography is introduced to colonial Australia in the 1840s and 1860s, at a time when the colonial population, who are its primary customers, are mostly first generation colonists, lots of the pictures made are sent out of Australia quite quickly because they are made for the purpose of being sent to family and friends abroad. And that's another reason why, if you look at the kind of archival representation of this period in Australian archives, you don't really get a sense of the kind of number of photographs that were actually produced, or the kind of popularity of the process, because so few photographs have actually ended up in Australian collections commensurate with what we know to have been made. So in the first chapter, I talk about a photographer called George Baron Goodman, who is well known and lots of people have written about him. We know that he, in archives around Australia, he has, less than a dozen photographs, but I go through the records and I think about the advertisements he was placing for his studio at various locations around Australian capitals in the 1840s, the paperwork around the amount of money he was making at these studios, and I kind of work out from his pricing list exactly how many photographs he would have taken, and to try and give a more kind of panoramic view of just the kind of clientele that these early studios were getting. If we remember that until photography, the opportunity to have a portrait taken is really an elite or high class exercise, and it's outside the scope of mainly all but the upper middle class and, of course, the colonial administration. So photography really kind of moves that portrait exercise to an expanded middle class, not necessarily a labouring class at first, but an expanded middle class. So it's kind of, I guess the book is kind of an exercise in not only kind of going to archives and, looking for images that may have fallen through the gaps in previous research, but it's also an exercise in excavating all that corollary material: shipping records, customs records, banking records, advertisements, press clippings, and marrying that with the images that we know that have survived, to say, hey, people like Goodman, we have 8 images in Australian collections, but he made upwards of 800, So just kind of thinking about how we position those extant surviving photographs in a more full view of a practice. And I think specifically in art history, lots of studies are driven by the object or the artwork that survives. And that only gives us a very kind of narrow view of this period of practice. So as researchers, we're very much compelled to do the extra legwork of creating a fuller picture from and beyond the visual.
Yes, well, you certainly do that. I mean, in many ways, the book is the story too, among other things, of the remarkable diffusion process and adaptation of a technology into a society over time. And as you say in your opening chapters, there wasn't a single moment when this technology arrived in a mature form. It arrived in a whole series of waves and different ways, and involved a lot of people initially experimenting and trying to come to terms with this new technology and equipment, wasn't it, on arrival?
Yes, I mean, you mentioned that Louis-Jacques Daguerre is responsible for commercializing the daguerreotype process in France, and that was unveiled at a joint meeting of the Society for Innovation and the Society for the Arts in 1839. But there are a lot of different players who are experimenting with photographic processes. Henry Fox Talbot in London in 1838 is developing a paper-based process. Before Daguerre, Nicéphore Nicephore, who doesn't survive until 1839, is a chemist who is working with light-sensitive chemistry in the south of France. So I guess the take-home point is the idea of a photographic process is really developed for the atmospheres of the smoggy, sooty industrial north and the northern hemisphere, where photography is an invention of industrialization in terms of its mechanics, and its chemistry is part of a broader global industrialization where chemicals and materials come from the world and are refined and developed in Britain and France. But then when those same materials and processes get sent out to the Australian colonies, of course, our atmosphere is completely different. And I think this is one of the main points of the book, is to say that rather than the history of photography as being a history of import-export, hermetic technology, kind of imagined elsewhere with camera equipment made elsewhere and then just neatly imported into Australia. Actually, there is a process of adjustment and adaptation that has to happen once those chemicals and apparatuses come here. So I guess I talk about one practitioner, Thomas Bock, who actually recalibrates his understanding of exposure times for the light in Nipaluna, Hobart, because the exposure times that he's working off for a studio in London, where obviously the exposure to make the photograph has to be much longer because of the weather and the pollution, whereas in Hobart, the clear air and the bright sun expedite the exposure. And there's lots of there's lots of examples of photographers having to kind of adapt, and that adaptation happens at a technological level, but it also happens at a kind of more consequential social and political level, which is how the technology is put to use in the context of the colonial project, in terms of mapping the colonial frontier as it kind of encroaches on First Nations territory, in redacting kind of visual evidence of First Nations occupation of land, in kind of celebrating the construction of colonial towns. These are all uses that photography doesn't have in metropolitan Europe. And I think, to say that sounds a bit obvious, but they're still not uses that are written into how we think about the evolution of the technology. So pretty much as soon as the raw materials of photography arrive in Australia, the camera, the chemistry, my argument is that a new history of photography emerges here. not one that's necessarily sealed off from the rest of the world. It's still in dialogue, but it's one where the practitioners of photography have to develop new ways of working and are working to kind of produce photographs for new markets and new kinds of customers.
Guest on Innovation Talk Radio Northern Beaches is Eliza DeCourcy, the author of the book Early Photography in Colonial Australia, particularly covering the early period 1840 to 1860, which was foundational in many ways in shaping the role and nature of photography in a colonial Australia and shaping our vision too, as we're hearing. Eliza, you speak at one point about mobile photographers, and we're talking here about how in the early days they set up commercial enterprises with studios, and particularly in the cities and around the ports for various logistic and commercial reasons. These people were also involved in a lot of innovation too, in the ways you've said. So
yeah, I guess there's many points to that question of mobility. The first is because of the time period and because of the people who are engaging with photographic practices, most, from a commercial point of view, most early photographers were compelled to travel to connect with colonial customers and colonial clients because the cities and the towns didn't have big enough populations or didn't have a thoroughfare of clients to sustain businesses for long periods of time. And of course, the gold rush changes that, but that really kind of kicks off towards the end of this period. The second consideration is that, for a lot of the very early processes, like the daguerreotype, the photographer really needed to have access to the darkroom and to process the image, to develop the image within a very short time of it being shot. And it's not until the 1860s where innovations in glass plate technology allow for a longer time period that people working with these camera technologies can shoot plates, keep them in their dark sleeve, and then wait a number of days until they're developed. But that comes much later. And still, we don't have a kind of mobile culture of photography in the sense that we might know it today because they're carrying sheets of glass around with them. So it's not film like maybe some of your listeners would understand in terms of that kind of more easily transportable material. I think, though, that there's a really important point to make, kind of tangential to this question, though, and it is constantly we have to think about these ideas of materiality and constraints with the actual ways that photographers innovated in using camera technology, because one of the really big arguments of this book is this narrative of kind of a volatile technology in the past and a delicate artifact object in the present kind of undercuts the importance and the consequence of these pictures in a way. And I actually start the book not in the kind of past, but in the present, looking at a number of First Nations artists who are reusing these old analog processes in their own practice to reclaim narratives of country and to create images for a contemporary archive that weren't created of Indigenous portraits, for example, in the work of James Tyler and Brenda L. Croft, landscape in the work of Danny Mellor. So I think it's really important when we're talking about materiality and we're talking about innovation, we're also talking about consequence, because we know, and I think this is the litmus test, we know about the consequence in terms of creating a colonial vision and a colonial state, because contemporary artists are still trying to reclaim the vision of land and the vision of subjectivity that was kind of, photography was implicated in corroding from this very early period. So there is a narrative of technological evolution that this early period is a part of. And obviously, as the technology improves, the camera and the photographers can travel further afield. But that doesn't mean that the consequence of the images is also linear in that same way. The first images of First Nations people are sent to to London in 1845. And these images are then, even though they're daguerreotypes, they're engraved in the Metropolitan Press and they're circulated globally. And this is a very kind of cataclysmic moment for the representation of Wiradjuri Woiwurrung people internationally, which they had no agency in constructing or controlling. So I think when we talk about innovation, we have to keep, a more broad view about, how that technology is still being used.
Yes, indeed, Eliza. Points very well made. But before the Australian colonial photographers moved out of their city-based studios and out into the big countryside and the landscapes, which we also read about in your book, they, of course, were reflecting, in a sense, images and visions of colonial inland expansion by the very fact that their studios were being populated and their businesses being paid for by the wealthy miners and pastoralists who came in a sense, to create the stories of their own, as you say, dynasties and progress. Well, as you imply, that was shaping the image at the time of colonial inland expansion, but there were big gaps and silences, as you've said, in the images that was conveying.
Yeah, and I mean that's again why I start with First Nations practice, because this isn't a history that's really contained to the 19th century. This is a history that still has consequence and is still being addressed in how First Nations artists look back at this period of image making and then try and fill those gaps and silences, or reclaim a view of the land that is from a First Nations perspective rather than one that celebrates colonial ambition. So yes, when we look at these pictures, like we look at all photographs, and we have to understand they come from they come from a position of an agenda. They are not, as any photograph, they are not just clear, unproblematic records. And I think what's interesting to me is that people are so blown away in the 19th century by the clarity and the precision of the photographic record that it sets up something that we still kind of get caught out by today, and that's the idea of the photograph as an absolute truth, the photograph as a clear document, the authority of the image. And for example, lots of early photographs that didn't have photography couldn't be translated into press illustrations until half-tone printing came into existence in the late 1870s, early 1880s. But before that, photographs were copied by an engraver and the engraving was illustrated. But in the caption for whatever illustration, it would say from a photograph, because the actual genesis of that image to a photograph carried so much weight in terms of the authority of the image, even though there's a process of translation, that it kind of bolstered the accuracy of the engraving. So we still get caught out by this idea of looking at photographs and thinking we're looking at something that could be unstaged or uncropped, or, a world that is from an objective point of view, when even in its earliest history, photography is, the shot is always framed around a person looking through the viewfinder and choosing what's in the picture and what's not.
As you say, there's always that tendency to view photography as objective and detailed. One of the consequences of this in Australia was, as we've said, the sort of overlooking of the Indigenous and the portrayal of Indigenous Aboriginal people in a very objectified way. But through your research and in your book, you've actually demonstrated that in the collaboration you've had with First Nations people, that somehow even from these very primitive photos, if you like, in terms of technology and portrayal, you can reclaim and they can reclaim some sense of self-expression and identity.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's another really important thing that we have to think about, that the histories that are present in these images, which were incidentally captured as well. So the opening chapter in the book looks at a series of outdoor portraits of Menang Noongar people from the southwest of the Australian continent, just before a time of huge dispossession and their uptake in missionary activity. And so even though these aren't first contact, this isn't a moment of first contact, but it is just before a moment of radical change. It's in a kind of extended moment of first contact, we could say. And in photographing Menang people, we see evidence of traditional dress and artifacts and objects, which, in talking with contemporary Menang knowledge holders and elders, there is narratives of kind of an endurance of culture to the present day that can be traced to these images now. Now, that wasn't the intention of the photographer at the time. The photographer at the time was creating kind of ethnographic images, well, kind of nascent ethnographic images, shoreline photographs. But now these images are very valuable to Menang people because, in their continuation of the practice of buka making, cloak making, in fire stick making, they see resonances of these kind of, practices that are much longer than European colonial occupation or conquest invasion, but are kind of, are captured by the camera rather incidentally at this time. So they are valuable in new ways that weren't intended at the time of their
In terms of the shift to landscape photography, which you deal with in some detail, it's quite a complex story in many ways. I was brought to reflect on a comment in your book that Daguerre, when he first brought this stuff in, thought that photography could be a great source of improved scientific knowledge and imperial knowledge and what the rest of it. But when it came to Australia, the photography, in a sense, ignored the huge indigenous knowledge of land and country, as we're discussing, and on the other hand, sort of turned photography and whatever, and landscape photography in particular, to the particular stories and purposes of colonization by focusing in the photography of landscapes with the technology available on productivity and industry and the possibilities and opportunities, didn't it?
Yeah, I think that's very important. There's a few things to say. Yes, it wasn't just Daguerre, but all the proponents of photographic technology thought that the clarity in representation would not only mean that photography was very useful in photographing the land, but in photographing and being incorporated into things like the study of natural history, which in the 19th century was huge in terms of the colonial world, as it had been in the 18th century. And I think the first thing to say is, yes, the book definitely outlines that the role of the camera was really in photographing the land as a productive entity, and the possibilities for various industries being developed. And I think that relates to the fact that photography is also used in this time at a lot of the imperial fairs and colonial fairs, which celebrate capital. If we think of Paris International, but also the various Melbourne colonial exhibitions where technology and science is on display. And in those contexts, photography is about kind of mineral extraction. It is about kind of fertile land. It is about agricultural development. And it shows scenes of kind of, an environment with untapped resources. And I think we know now that was a really destructive narrative to put forward, but at the time that's how it was used. The second point is that, the study of natural history for the preceding 2 centuries had aimed at an illustrative mode that was absolutely exact and indexical in terms of drawing, draftsmanship and printing. And lots of people assumed that photography would move into this space as the more authoritative medium of expression. But, for much of the 19th century, photography can't compete with established natural history modes of illustration because it is monochrome. Photography can't be colored to the same level of verisimilitude that a competent draftsman can color a flower specimen, for example. So there's lots of aspirations for photography, but not all of them come to pass immediately.
Well, look, thanks very much, Eliza, for joining us here on Innovation Talk Radio Northern Beaches to talk about your wonderful book, Early Photography in Colonial Australia, particularly focusing on the technology and its interaction with the imagining and the shaping and the visioning of Australia, particularly through its colonial era. You wind up with a good discussion, which you've hinted at, of how technologies of reproduction and circulation, including globally, effectively underlined and promoted, I think you call the ideological power of colonial photography and the technology that it did. And your book does a wonderful job in your language of confirming to us and emphasizing how important those first couple of decades were and deeply consequential for the way in which and the role in which photography took in the colonial project, if you like. So thanks so much for joining us on Radio Northern Beaches, Eliza.
Thanks very much for having me, Michael. Thank you.
Australia, the lucky country. We've got meat pies. We've got the world's best beer. But most importantly, top of the list, we've got Radio Northern Beaches 88.7, 90.3. Now hitting the entire world on www.rnb.org.au.